The survey drone sent back exactly 47 seconds of footage before it stopped transmitting. Not destroyed, not jammed, stopped, as though it had seen something it was not designed to process and simply decided against continuing. Exocartographer Vane Sareth replayed those 47 seconds 11 times in the 3 hours before her ship reached orbital insertion. She told herself she was being thorough. She told herself this was standard procedure for a Class 9 dead world assessment. She told herself a lot of things during those 3 hours, and none of them explained why her hands had developed a slight tremor by the time the planet filled her forward viewport. Kareth's Drift. That was what the Interstellar Survey Commission had named it in the database. A sterile rock orbiting a dim yellow star at the outer edge of a forgotten system, catalogued 23 years ago by an automated probe, flagged for potential mineral extraction, and subsequently ignored. Dead worlds outnumbered living ones by roughly 1,000 to 1 across explored space. Nobody had reason to think about Kareth's Drift twice. Nobody except the humans. And the humans, she now understood with a cold, sliding certainty she couldn't quite name, had been very, very quiet about this place for a very long time. The drone footage showed nothing dramatic. That was the disturbing part. It showed a crater field in the northern hemisphere, which was expected. It showed oxidized iron plains under a thin, unbreathable atmosphere, which was expected. It showed the ruins of something geometric shapes half buried in sediment, angles too deliberate for geology, and then, in the final 9 seconds of footage, it showed a light. Not sunlight, not atmospheric refraction, something below the surface. Something that had, apparently, noticed the drone first. Vane had transmitted her preliminary report to Commission headquarters 4 hours ago. She had not yet received a response. This was also unusual because the Commission always responded within 90 minutes, even to routine filings. The silence from headquarters was, she was beginning to understand, its own kind of answer. She was not supposed to land. Her mandate was orbital survey, atmospheric sample collection, preliminary geological mapping. She had a crew of 3 herself, her systems analyst Preth, and the navigation officer whose name she still occasionally mispronounced, despite 6 months of shared shipboard space. His name was Counselor Auxiliary Don Marsh, though he had quietly mentioned 3 times that he'd prefer she just call him Don. He was human. He was the reason she had requested this assignment. She had thought at the time that having a human crew member on a dead world survey was simply procedurally efficient. Humans had extensive records of operating in hostile atmospheric conditions, and their biological redundancy made them valuable on difficult surveys. She had not considered, when making that request, that the human might know something she didn't. Don was standing at the forward observation panel when she found him, 3 minutes after orbital insertion. He was not reviewing navigation data. He was not running atmospheric models. He was standing completely still, hands at his sides, staring at the planet below with an expression she had never encountered in 6 years of working alongside humans. "You've been here before," she said. It was not a question. He didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. "Don." "Not here," he said. "Not exactly here." He touched the viewport glass with 2 fingers, very gently, the way she had seen humans touch old photographs. "But somewhere like it." She waited. "How old does the Commission think this place is?" he asked. "Geological surveys suggest the surface formations are approximately 400 million years old. The ruins in the northern sector are obviously younger, but the dating hasn't been. 11,000 years, he said quietly. Give or take a century." Vane felt something shift in the room. Not physically. Something in the quality of the air or in the way her own mind was processing what she'd just heard. "That's impossible. Nothing survives 11,000 years of planetary surface exposure without." "Most things don't," he agreed. He turned away from the viewport, and she saw something in his face that she had no species-specific framework for interpreting. It wasn't fear. She knew fear on human faces. She had seen it, studied it, cataloged its micro-expressions across 17 months of xenosociological study before her first posting. This was something older than fear, something humans apparently reserved for the moments when history became personal. "I need to go down," he said. Your mandate doesn't include surface. I know what my mandate includes. He looked at her steadily. I need to go down. She should have said no. She understood this later, reviewing the sequence of decisions that had brought her here. She should have said no, filed a formal request for a surface survey team, followed protocol, waited for the commission's silence to become an answer. She understood all of this later. In the moment, looking at Don's face and the way the planet's dim light caught the viewport glass between them, she said, "Give me 20 minutes to prep a descent module." What she didn't know, what she would spend the next 72 hours slowly, terrifyingly learning, was that the commission's silence wasn't bureaucratic delay. The commission had stopped responding because someone else had started responding for them. The northern crater field was worse in person. Not dangerous, not physically. The atmosphere was thin but manageable with a standard rebreather. The radiation index was within tolerable parameters. The surface temperature was cold but predictable. It was worse in a way that was harder to name. The geometry of the ruins was wrong in a way that the drone footage hadn't captured. From orbit, the buried shapes had looked like ancient architecture, collapsed walls, eroded foundations, the structural archaeology of something that had once stood and fallen. From the ground, walking among them, Vane kept experiencing the nauseating sensation that the structures weren't collapsed at all, that they were exactly as they were meant to be. That what she was reading as ruin was actually design. These weren't buildings, she said. Dawn crouched beside a slab of material she couldn't identify, not stone, not alloy, something in between, something that showed no weathering despite 11,000 years of claimed exposure. No, he agreed. Then what were they? He ran his hand along the surface. Under his palm, something happened. She almost dismissed it as a trick of the light. The dim yellow star was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the crater field, but the surface of the slab had changed. Not physically, not visibly, but her suit's electromagnetic sensors registered a pulse, a single clean wave of something that wasn't radiation and wasn't radio and wasn't any category her instruments had a name for, moving outward from Dawn's hand across the crater field in a perfect expanding ring. Dawn, I know. What did you? I've done this before. He stood slowly. In other places, places that looked like this. How many places? He was quiet for a moment that lasted several seconds too long. 6, he said, that I know of. Vane's threat assessment instincts were screaming at her, but she couldn't identify what they were screaming about. There was no physical danger. There was no hostile presence. There was only Dawn, standing in an ancient crater field, having just done something with his hand that her instruments couldn't categorize, telling her this was not his first time. What happens next? She managed. He looked at the ground beneath their feet. It wakes up, he said, and then we find out if it remembers us. She wanted to ask what it was. She wanted to ask what remembers us meant, specifically in this context, on this dead world with its impossible ruins and its unexplained light and its drone that had stopped transmitting mid-footage. She wanted a great many things, standing in that crater field on Kareth's drift, and what she got instead was the ground beginning to move. Not seismic, not geological. The ground was descending, smoothly and with complete mechanical precision, in a circle approximately 400 meters in diameter, carrying them with it. Down, into the planet, into something she had no framework for, that her instruments were recording but not understanding, that her mind was processing as wrongness and enormity, and a scale of engineering that she had never encountered and had not, until this moment, believed was possible. How far down? She said very calmly, which was not at all how she felt. Don checked something on his wrist unit. About 2 kilometers, he said, and at the bottom of 2 kilometers, he looked at her. The expression on his face was the same one she'd seen at the viewport, that ancient pre-fear thing that humans apparently carried under everything else, under all their adaptability and their chaos and their relentless forward motion. Home, he said quietly. Sort of. The chamber at the bottom was not the size of a room. It was the size of a city. Vane stood at the edge of the descending platform and understood, for the first time in her professional life, that she had fundamentally misunderstood the scale of something. The chamber extended in every direction, not just horizontally but vertically, tiered galleries rising into dimness above them, corridors branching off in organized patterns that she recognized, after a moment of shock, as something like street grids. The lighting was internal, that same sourceless luminescence her drone had caught, now filling the entire space with pale blue-white radiance that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. And the ship was there. She had expected something. She had not expected this. The vessel occupied the center of the chamber the way a heart occupies a chest, not as an object resting in a space, but as the reason the space existed. It was vast in the way that made her species-specific size estimation instincts simply give up and report large without further detail. It was smooth in some places and deliberately angular in others, following an aesthetic logic she couldn't decode. It was clearly, unmistakably, thousands of years old, and it was clearly, unmistakably not damaged, not dormant, not dead, waiting. How? She said, and stopped because there were too many ways to complete that sentence. The Commission knows about 4 sites, Don said. He was walking toward the vessel without hesitation, with the ease of someone navigating a familiar space. They think they know what's in them. They have theories. He glanced back at her. Wrong ones. Don, what is this? He stopped walking. He turned to face her fully, and for the first time since they'd landed, she saw the fear underneath whatever the other thing was. He was afraid. He had been afraid this entire time, she realized. He had descended 2 kilometers into a dead world, into a chamber that shouldn't exist, toward a ship that had been sleeping for 11,000 years, and he had been afraid the whole way down. He had just not let it stop him. That was the moment she began to understand something about humans that she had not understood before. This is a warship, he said. It was built during a war you don't have records of because the civilization that built it was very specifically erased from every database in the galaxy. The ones that aren't commission-controlled anyway. He paused. The civilization was human. Vane said nothing. 11,000 years ago, give or take, Don continued. There was a war. Humans lost it, decisively, completely, in every conventional military sense of the word. The civilization that won erased human history from galactic records, scattered the survivors, and declared the species extinct. He looked at the ship. They made one mistake. She heard herself ask, what mistake? They believed their own declaration, he said. They stopped looking. The ship recognized him. There was no other way to interpret what happened when he placed his hand on the hull, not a sensor panel, not a designated access point, just the hull itself. A seamless expanse of that same unweathered alloy, not alloy material. It recognized him the way something recognizes a frequency it was built to receive. There was light. There was a sound below the threshold of hearing that Vane felt in her chest cavity, and then the ship simply opened. Not a door. It didn't form a door. The hull became permeable locally, where his hand touched it and he walked through, and she followed because standing alone in a 2-kilometer underground chamber seemed significantly worse than whatever was happening inside. Inside was ordered. That was the word. 11,000 years of nothing, and the interior of the ship was ordered, surfaces clean, systems apparently functional, corridors clearly intentionally designed for human proportions. She had been in human-designed spaces before. Human ships, human stations, human habitats adapted for mixed-species crews. She knew what human engineering looked like. This felt related to that but fundamentally older, like reading a language that had evolved over millennia and encountering the words that hadn't changed. How is it intact? She said. 11,000 years. How is any of this? It was designed to last, Don said. He was moving through the corridors with slow reverence, touching surfaces occasionally, reading something in the ship's response that she couldn't detect. Not maintained, designed. They built ships differently then. They were building for a longer timeline. What timeline? He stopped at a junction. The corridor ahead opened into a larger space. She could see light, movement, systems activating in sequence. How long does it take a species to rebuild from nothing? He asked. With no technology, no infrastructure, no historical records, how many generations before you're back to the stars? She ran the calculation. It was a standard commission xenosociological metric used for post-collapse civilization modeling. depending on survival, population, and environmental conditions. 500 years minimum, likely closer to 1,000. And if you're starting from genuinely nothing, not just no technology, no written language, no preserved knowledge of any kind, if everything has been taken, she ran it again. 3,000 years perhaps, possibly more. 11,000, Don said. We took 11,000 years. He walked toward the larger space. They thought that was long enough. They thought any species that took 11,000 years to claw back to the stars must have learned something, must have become something other than what we were. He looked back at her. They miscalculated. She followed him into the larger space, which turned out to be the bridge, or what the humans of 11,000 years ago had called a bridge. It was enormous. It was built for a crew of hundreds, and it was alive now in the same sourceless light way as the chamber outside. Screens and panels and surfaces she had no names for activating in cascading waves as the ship processed Don's presence and updated its understanding of the universe it had been sleeping inside. There were names on the walls. Not decorative, structural, part of the ship's architecture. Hundreds of names in a script that was clearly ancestral to modern human writing, carved into the material of the ship itself. Crew, she asked. Not exactly. He was at the central console, which had lit for him alone, and she watched him interact with a system 11,000 years old with the ease of someone who had practiced this, who had done this before, who had been trained for exactly this moment. These are the names of the ones who built it, the ones who chose to hide it, the ones who chose to wait. Wait for what? For someone to come back. He looked up from the console, across the bridge, at the hundreds of names carved into the walls. For someone to come back and be willing to use it. Vane felt the dread before she understood why. She catalogued the sensation, a spreading coolness beginning at her secondary respiratory organ and moving outward, and she ran through the possible sources. And she understood. When you say the civilization that won the war erased humans from galactic records, she said carefully, and you say they declared the species extinct. Yes. What species? Don was quiet for 3 full seconds. You need to understand, he said slowly, that I have spent a very long time not answering that question. Not because I don't know, because the answer is the kind of thing that changes what happens next, and I needed to be sure this was the moment to change it. He looked at her. You have a species-wide reputation for fairness, Sarath, you specifically. The Commission's records on you, the public ones anyway, they said you were the most genuinely fair assessor in the survey division. That's why I requested this posting. You requested this posting. Someone had to be here, he said. Someone had to witness it. Someone whose testimony the council chambers would actually receive. He turned back to the console. The Commission isn't silent because of bureaucratic delay. The Commission is silent because one of its 11 founding member species got a notification the moment my drone, my personal observation drone, which I sent before the survey drone, which is why the survey drone only got 47 seconds of footage, got a notification the moment my drone broadcast the awakening signal, and they have been managing the information flow for the past 6 hours. The coolness in her chest became something acute. Which species? He said the name. She had dealt with them. Her entire career she had dealt with them in council chambers, in joint survey operations, in the 14 separate interspecies protocols that governed survey commission operations. They were one of the founding species, one of the oldest members of the galactic community, one of the civilizations that had, by their own historical account, been exploring the stars for 30,000 years. They were the ones who, yes, they erased, yes, they declared humanity, yes, he said it gently, not cruelly, and they have spent 11,000 years making sure the erasure held, shaping the commission, shaping galactic history, shaping the narrative of humanity as a young species, a new species, a species without deep history. He touched the console and the ship responded, and something massive began moving somewhere deep in the vessel's infrastructure. They were very thorough. The one thing they couldn't account for was human patience. Humans aren't patient, she said reflexively, because everyone knew this. It was one of the most documented human characteristics in xenosociological literature. The relentless forward momentum, the inability to wait, the constant forward-charging urgency that other species found exhausting. No, Don agreed. We're not patient, we're something else. The ship shuddered once gently, not violence, recognition. We're stubborn. There's a difference. Patience is comfortable waiting. Stubbornness is refusing to stop even when everything hurts, even when it's been 11,000 years, even when you've been told 100 generations in a row that you're a young species without history. He looked at his hands. We never forgot. We couldn't prove it and we couldn't access the evidence, and every official record said we were wrong, but we never forgot. The ship took 6 hours to fully awaken. 6 hours in which Vane sent 3 reports to Commission headquarters and received no response. 6 hours in which Don moved through the vessel with slow, methodical care, reactivating systems in a specific order that he had clearly rehearsed, touching points on walls that activated cascades of function she couldn't track. 6 hours in which she began to understand that whatever was happening, it had not begun today. It had not begun 6 months ago when Don had requested this posting. It had been building for 11,000 years, in the quiet spaces between official history, in the places where humans kept the things they refused to forget. Around the 3rd hour, she found the archive. It was off a secondary corridor, behind a section of hull that opened the same way the ship's exterior had opened, in response to her presence, not because she was human, but because the ship had apparently made a decision about her and was treating her as crew. She stood in front of rows of storage systems stretching into distance, containing records in human script and human data formats that she had no way to fully read, and she understood with sudden vertiginous clarity that the Commission's official history of humanity was a draft. A controlled, deliberately incomplete, carefully maintained draft, and the original was here. She called Don. He came, looked at the archive, and was silent for a long time. "How much of this survives elsewhere?" she asked. "Not enough," he said. "Fragments, stories, things that sound like mythology because they were passed down verbally through generations that had no written language. Things the Commission classifies as human cultural mythology because they can't prove it happened." He touched an archive unit. "This is the proof." He looked at her. "This is why the ship was hidden, not the weapons, not the propulsion, this." She had been thinking of it as a warship. She had been thinking about weapons, about military capability, about what a vessel of this scale could do against a modern fleet. She had been asking the wrong question. "It was hidden to preserve the records," she said. "The records and the names and the testimony of everyone who built it." His voice was steady in the way of something that has had a long time to become steady. They knew they were losing the war. They knew what losing meant, not just defeat, but erasure. They had maybe a year, and they used it to build something that would last long enough for the truth to come back. He looked at the rows of archive units. "They built it for us, for the people who would come back, for whoever came down here first and was willing to look." Vane thought about the drone footage. 47 seconds, the light below the surface. "It was waiting for a human," she said. "The awakening sequence. It needed a human to initiate it." "It needed a human who knew what to look for," Don corrected. "The genetic markers alone wouldn't have been enough. Anyone could come down here and touch the hull and nothing would happen. It needed someone who came here already knowing it was here, which meant someone who had been told, which meant the knowledge had survived, which meant they hadn't actually erased you," she said quietly. He nodded. "Once, slowly. They declared us extinct. They erased the records. They scattered the survivors and they managed the narrative for 11,000 years." He looked up at the archive. "And the one thing they couldn't do was reach into our mouths and pull out the stories we told our children." The ship broke surface 2 hours later, not violently, not explosively. The 2 kilometers of rock above them simply parted in a mechanism she had never seen and could not describe, creating a passage wide enough for the vessel to ascend through in the same patient, precise way that it did everything else. The ship moved like something that had been designed to move exactly this way, through exactly this kind of passage, and had been waiting for the opportunity. In orbit, 2 ships were waiting, not commissioned survey vessels, not anything with commission markings. Don identified them from the bridge sensors before she could, which told her, quietly and devastatingly, that he had known they would be there, that this too had been anticipated. "Hegemony vessels," he said, "patrol class." He looked at the sensor data without visible alarm. They got here faster than I expected. Don, this ship is 11,000 years old. Its weapon systems, whatever they are, cannot. I know. He was already at the communications array, and she saw now that he was doing something she hadn't seen anyone do in 6 years of deep space survey work. He was broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously, unencrypted, with no authentication protocols, in the most direct and undisguised transmission possible. I know it can't win a military engagement with 2 modern patrol vessels. He looked at the sensor feeds showing the approaching ships. That's not what it needs to do. Then what does it need to do? Exist, he said simply. Be seen, be recorded, be transmitted. He gestured at the communications panel, and she saw now what the cascade of transmissions were carrying. The archive, the records, the testimony of 11,000 years, being broadcast in every direction on every frequency to every receiver within range, including the Commission relay satellite she had passed on approach, including the 6 other Commission survey vessels in adjacent systems, including, she realized with a lurch, the civilian shipping lanes that cross this system's outer edge every 36 hours. You were never going to use the weapons, she said. The weapons aren't the point. He watched the hegemony vessels on the sensors, watching them come, watching their weapon systems charge in the universal language of implied threat. They erased the history because the history was dangerous. They couldn't allow a record to exist of what they'd done, because what they'd done was the kind of thing that changes the balance of power in galactic politics. He looked at her. The ship is a library, Sorath. The weapons are just to make sure the library is taken seriously. The hegemony vessels hailed them. She watched Don receive the hail, and she watched his face in the moment of reception, and she saw the fear was still there, unchanged, the same pre-fear thing that had been there since the viewport. He was still afraid. He had known this moment was coming for, she was beginning to understand most of his adult life, and he was still afraid, and he was answering the hail, and he was continuing. He said, into the open channel, everything I'm broadcasting is already transmitted. You can destroy this ship. You can't undo what's been sent. The silence from the hegemony vessels lasted almost 30 seconds. Then they broadcast to Commission headquarters, and she saw the content of that broadcast because Don had patched her into all channels, and the content was 7 words in the hegemony's formal communication protocol, which she had learned during her xenosociological training, which translated approximately as, "The matter requires immediate council-level consultation. Not an attack, not an ultimatum, a retreat into procedure." The oldest response of the powerful when confronted with something they can't simply eliminate. It was not a victory. Vane understood this clearly. It was the beginning of something that would take years, possibly decades, certainly long past any timeline she could personally navigate. There would be council proceedings and counter-evidence and managed narratives and political maneuvering, and every tool that a species with 30,000 years of institutional experience could bring to bear on a problem that threatened their position. But the archive was transmitted. The records existed now in 10,000 receivers across a dozen systems. The ship was visible on the sensors of every vessel in range. And the name of the civilization that had declared humanity extinct, the name that the Commission had removed from every database associated with the war of 11,000 years ago, the name that survived only in the stories humans told their children, that name was on the broadcast too. Don sat down on the bridge of a ship older than most galactic civilizations, surrounded by the names of the people who had built it for exactly this moment, and he put his head in his hands. Not defeat. Understood that looking at him. He was allowing something to process that had been held back for a very long time, and she recognized this as a human behavior she had documented but never fully understood, the way humans sometimes had to feel the weight of something before they could carry it forward. 6 sites, she said after a moment. You said you'd done this in 6 other places. He looked up. What was in the other sites? He held her gaze for a moment, and then he said, other ships. The dread came back, colder and more complete than before. How many ships? He was quiet for 3 seconds, long enough that she knew the answer was going to change the size of everything she'd been calculating. 47, he said, that we've found. He looked at the viewport, at the cold stars and the hegemony vessels sitting at cautious distance. We don't know how many there are in total. The archive here might tell us. There may be more. There may be significantly more. He paused. We built a lot of ships during that war, Sarath. We were very, very motivated. Vane thought about a civilization declaring a species extinct. She thought about 11,000 years of managed history. She thought about the stories that survive in mouths when everything else has been taken. She thought about 47 ships sleeping below dead worlds across the galaxy. 47 ships that looked dormant, that looked like the relics of a civilization that had been decisively, completely defeated, that were broadcasting nothing and drawing no attention and appearing, from every external observation, to be exactly as dead as the species that had built them. And she thought about what a species looks like when it has lost everything, when it has been scattered and erased and declared extinct and stripped of its history, and it has spent 11,000 years not recovering, not rebuilding, not growing back into power in any way that could be observed or measured or managed, just waiting, stubbornly, quietly, inexhaustibly waiting, not because they were patient, because they were simply not willing to stop. She thought about all of that, and the dread became something she didn't have a category for. The hegemony doesn't know about the other sites, she said. They know about 4, Don said. They've been watching those 4 for centuries. They think they know what's inside them. A pause. They've been wrong about humans before. He stood. He walked to the viewport. He looked at the stars with the expression she still couldn't name, the old thing, the pre-fear thing, the thing under everything else. Below them, Kareth's drift was already changing as the ship's ascent had disturbed the northern crater field, cracking the surface in long, radiating lines, letting the pale blue-white light out into the dark in a way the survey drones would record and the commissioned satellites would log and every receiver in the system would see. A dead world, announced to be dead for 23 years, lit from within. What happens now? Vane asked. Don considered the question for a long time. Now the galaxy has to decide, he said, what it's going to do with a species that spent 11,000 years learning how to be underestimated. She watched him, and she thought about the 47 ships. She thought about the ones they hadn't found. She thought about the humans she had worked with over 6 years, their momentum, their urgency, their relentless forward pressure that everyone described as impatience. She thought about how she had always interpreted that quality as a weakness, a lack of control, an evolutionary trait that made them volatile and difficult to predict and poorly suited for the long timelines of galactic politics. She thought about how it felt now, knowing that the same species that couldn't wait for bureaucratic response times had waited 11,000 years. She thought, it wasn't impatience at all. It was precision. They only moved fast when moving fast mattered. They only held still when holding still was the strategy. 11,000 years of holding still, and the moment arrived, they moved. Outside, the hegemony vessels had not moved. Inside the archive, 47,000 years of true human history was waiting to be read. And somewhere across the galaxy, in crater fields and ocean floors and subsurface vaults on worlds the Survey Commission had catalogued as dead and forgotten, other ships were sleeping, waiting for other humans to come home. Waiting for the moment in each location when someone who knew what to look for would put their hand on ancient alloy and wake something up. Vane looked at Dawn, at the planet below them, at the stars beyond the viewport, and she understood for the first time in her career that she had been surveying the wrong thing. She had been looking at planets, cataloging geology, measuring atmospheres, assessing mineral potential. She had been looking at the dead surfaces of worlds and classifying them by what was visible from the top. She had never once thought to look underneath. None of them had. That was the calculation error. That was the gap between what the hegemony had done and what the hegemony had achieved, the space between erasure and elimination. They had removed humanity from the sky, which was visible. They had never accounted for what a species does when the sky is taken from it, where it goes, how deep it buries the things it refuses to surrender. The commission would convene. The council chambers would fill. The hegemony would argue and manage and maneuver. And in the meantime, in the spaces between the arguments, in the archives and the transmitted records and the testimony of 11,000 years of stubborn, painful, inexhaustible survival, the galaxy would begin to understand something about the species it had spent 11,000 years misclassifying. Not the strongest, not the most advanced, not the most ancient or the most powerful or the most strategically sophisticated, just the species that could not be made to stop, the species that looked at extinction and called it a delay, the species that built 47 ships during a war they were losing, aimed not at victory, but at the next time, at the humans who would come after the defeat, after the erasure, after the 11,000 years of managed silence, and who would need something waiting for them below the dead ground of forgotten worlds. The species that carved the names of its builders into the walls of vessels designed to outlast civilizations, so that whoever came home would know they had not been forgotten either. Vane thought about all of that, and she understood with a slow and permanent clarity that the hegemony hadn't made one mistake. They had made the only mistake that mattered. They had looked at humanity at its absolute lowest, defeated, scattered, stripped of everything, declared dead, and they had seen an ending. And what they had actually been watching was something humans had done so many times, over so many scales, in so many contexts, that it had become architectural, structural. Built into ships and buried in planets and transmitted on every frequency simultaneously when the moment finally came. It wasn't an ending. It was how humans began.